So, meine Damen und Herren, liebe Studierende, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen und auch liebe Familie von Herrn Rückert, wie ich gerade festgestellt habe. Mein Name ist Jens Dibbern und ich begrüße Sie im Rahmen der Digitalisierungskommission sehr herzlich zu unserer heutigen Veranstaltung. Wir begrüßen sehr herzlich Herrn Professor Daniel Rückert von der Technischen Universität München als eingeladenen Gastredner von unserer Vortragsreihe. Ich möchte ganz kurz ein bisschen den Rahmen der Veranstaltung beleuchten. Es geht zurück auf die Strategie der Universität, Strategie 2030, in der sie die digitale Transformation als eine wichtige Teilstrategie erkannt und ausgerufen hat. Und im Rahmen dieser Strategie hat sie einen Umsetzungsplan entwickelt, in dessen Folge auch die Digitalisierungskommission entstanden ist. Und der haben wir auch heute den Event zu verdanken. Ja, die Digitalisierung ist mittlerweile überall angekommen, nicht nur in der Wirtschaft oder privat, sondern eben auch in der Universität. Die Universität hat erkannt, dass sie sich auch selber digitalisieren muss, aber dass sie auch Vorreiter in der Forschung zur Digitalisierung sein muss. Ja, was Digitalisierung heißt, davon können wir alle ein Lied singen. Ich glaube, jeder von uns verbringt täglich mehrere Stunden mit seinem Smartphone, mit digitalen Geräten und neuerdings auch mit ChatGPT als persönlichen Assistent. Und diese Entwicklung, gerade auch in der künstlichen Intelligenz, hat jetzt auch in der Medizin natürlich maßgebliche Entwicklungen nach sich gezogen. Deshalb heute auch der Vortrag von Herrn Rückert, der uns hier interessante Einblicke geben wird. Ja, die künstliche Intelligenz hat allerdings nicht nur große Mehrwerte für den Mensch, aber auch für die Gesellschaft. Es gibt auch große Herausforderungen. Und ich glaube, manchmal sind wir selber auch geneigt, fast im Sinne von Goethes Gedicht zu dem Zauberlehrling zu rufen: Herr, die Not ist groß, die ich rief, die Geister werde ich nun nicht mehr los. ChatGPT, künstliche Intelligenz, werden wir wahrscheinlich nicht mehr loswerden. Sie wird da sein, sie wird uns begleiten und wir müssen lernen, sie zu beherrschen. Das war eben auch eines der Anliegen der Universität, die Digitalisierungskommission ins Leben zu rufen. Sie hat tatsächlich ein Budget von 20 Millionen gesprochen, um Forschung in der Universität Bern zur Digitalisierung zu fördern, bottom-up zu initiieren und insbesondere das Thema Menschen-digitale Transformation zu beleuchten. Und ich glaube, da passt der Vortrag von Ihnen, Herr Rückert, heute ganz hervorragend. Und um Sie noch kurz einzuleiten, möchte ich das Wort übergeben an meine liebe Kollegin Christiane Tretter, die im letzten Jahr den Vorsitz hatte in der Digitalisierungskommission und in ihrer Rolle sie auch noch eingeladen hatte. Und deshalb, Christiane, möchte ich dir gerne das Wort übergeben, um Herrn Rückert kurz uns vorzustellen. Ihnen alle wünsche ich schon jetzt einen faszinierenden Vortrag. Nicht nur diejenigen, die heute im Hörsaal sind, sondern vielleicht auch diejenigen, die später den Vortrag dann noch als Video genießen können. Der wird heute aufgenommen, aufgezeichnet und im Internet zur Verfügung gestellt. Bitte schön, Christiane.
Danke, Jens. Also a warm welcome from my side to the audience present in the room and to the audience listening to the podcast later. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Daniel Rückert. Professor Rückert studied computer science at the Technical University in Berlin, and then he moved on to the UK and completed his PhD at Imperial College London in '97. Then he spent 2 years of postdoc at King's College London and returned then for an assistant professorship to Imperial College London. And he has been, since 2005, then professor for visual information processing at Imperial College London, and since 2020 he has been a professor for artificial intelligence in healthcare and medicine at the Technical University of Munich in the frame of a prestigious Alexander von Humboldt professorship. If I understand that correctly, that's a program also to tear back Germans abroad to home. And Professor Rückert has held impressive grants from ERC, EPSRC from the UK, German Research Foundation and others. He has supervised a really impressive number of PhD students and postdocs. And as you can imagine, this scientific track record has not remained unnoticed. So since 2015, he has become member of various academies. For example, the Royal Academy of Engineering, then the Academy of Medical Sciences, London, and then the two German academies, Leopoldina and Berlin-Brandenburgische Akademie der Wissenschaften. So it's a really great honor to have you here tonight, and so we are looking forward to your talk, AI and the Future of Medicine. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a really great pleasure to be here. Thank you for the very kind invitation. I'm really happy to be able to make it here. And as was already mentioned in the introduction, AI and medicine is a very interesting symbiotic combination. And I would like to convince you in this talk that there's a lot of potentials, there are some pitfalls, but there are also approaches to overcome these pitfalls. So let me first start, because I thought this is a general audience, with a very broad introduction into the topic of AI, before I move into the applications in medicine. And of course, when we think about AI, we can sort of try to come up with a definition of what AI is. And this is a very traditional definition of AI. And it basically says, well, we want to have a system which can perform tasks that are characteristic of human intelligence. So you see already, we're trying to compare the machine to the human. And in the beginning of this sort of development, in the sort of 70s, 80s, people thought, well, one characteristic of human intelligence is, for example, the ability to play chess. And we started off with developing systems which were able to play chess. We realized that actually works very well for the computer, and the computer just has more computational power. How about games like Sudoku, Go, for example, which AlphaGo, of course, also exceeded very well in. So games became very soon not a very good benchmark for AI. The sort of traditional definition of what is human intelligence is sort of, can we fool the human into thinking that they're interacting with another human rather than a machine? And this is called the Turing test, proposed by Alan Turing, one of the pioneers of computer science a long time ago. And it turned out, actually, I think if you try to apply this Turing test today, there are many systems which will pass the Turing test. I think if you interact with ChatGPT, for most people it's very hard to actually determine that they're talking to a machine rather than a human. If you generate pictures like this, well, it probably looks implausible, but looks very realistic. So it's very, very hard to detect that this is a computer-generated image which doesn't exist in the reality. So none of these tests probably are very good ways of measuring artificial intelligence these days. So I would also like to stipulate that perhaps most of the things we do at the moment are not really artificial intelligence, but perhaps machine learning. And that's a much more prescribed area or definition. And that is basically a branch of mathematics, computer science, statistics, where we say, well, we take some data, we apply a model, and with that model and that data, we can make a prediction. And that might be, in this particular case, for example, the data might be, for example, measurements from a self-driving car. We have cameras, we have radar sensors, we measure the environment. We then sort of build a model of that environment, for example, a 3D map of the world where we can drive, where we cannot drive. And then we can make predictions, what actions to take. Should we turn left? Should we brake? Should we accelerate? So this is a fairly prescribed definition, and this is perhaps most of what I will talk about today actually falls into that category rather than into the artificial general intelligence category. But I also want to give you a very brief overview of what types of machine learning you can use in medicine, but also more generally. And I think for those of you who are a bit familiar with this topic, this will look very, very familiar. This is sort of the traditional machine learning approach where we call this discriminative machine learning, because we're trying to separate, for example, two groups of patients or two types of images by learning this separating hyperplane. We try to separate the red points from the blue points. And when we do this, we typically also learn from supervised, or we learn in a supervised fashion. That means we actually have labeled examples. I know which points are the red ones, which ones are the blue ones, and I try to learn this separating line here. And once I've learned that, I of course can apply this to new data points which come in. And so you might, for example, say, well, my data points are not really two-dimensional. They're actually very high-dimensional. For example, they're images. They're images of cats and dogs, and I'm trying to automatically build a system which detects which one is a cat, which one is a dog. So this is one type of machine learning, discriminative machine learning called supervised learning. There's a second type of machine learning which is also very common, very useful, and that's what we call sort of unsupervised learning. I don't know which ones are cats and which ones are dogs, so I only have blue points, but even though I look at these blue points, I can see that there are sort of two clusters of points, and I want to separate these two clusters of points. So that's a harder task. It's much more demanding. It's quite often something we as humans can do relatively easily. But it's very hard for the machine, and it sort of tries to find structure in a set of data points. And if I show you, for example, these data points, it's not so obvious how you should cluster them. So it can be quite challenging. But perhaps what has sort of captured most of the imagination in the last 2 years or 3 years is something called generative machine learning. And here in this particular case, we're not trying to separate one group of points from another group of points, but we're learning the distribution of these data points. So for example here, instead of trying to separate, simply differentiate one class from another class, we try to model how these classes are distributed. And why is that interesting? Because that's something, for example, ChatGPT or other systems do, is because we can then sort of sample from these distributions and generate new examples. So for example, here you see lots of different images of the Pope, which are all sort of generated by taking new points in this distribution and looking what do they correspond to as images. And if I sort of modify this, I can sort of, for example, add and subtract attributes. For example, I can do arithmetic operations where I say I want a Pope, but I also want a white fluffy jacket, and I can sort of add these things together. And this ability to generate new data points is incredibly important, because that's what, for example, ChatGPT does. It generates answers based on prompts you give it, and if you run this multiple times, you typically also get slightly different answers. So you're sampling in the neighborhood of these data points, and you're generating these examples from that. So there are many, many different types of neural networks which can be used to implement this, and almost everything which I will show you today is based on neural networks. So here's a sort of a chart I found with all the different classes of neural networks, and I'm not trying to go into technical details how all these different networks work, but I wanted to sort of highlight the basic idea of what they actually do. And that is sort of to think about a network like this is perhaps to think of a machine where you have lots of knobs which control something which we call the weights in this neural network, and which, if you change one of these weights, they actually achieve a different output. So you can tune this machine by fiddling with all these different knobs. Now, this machine has, I don't know, probably 1,000 knobs. If you look at a model such as ChatGPT, it probably has in the order of several billions of these knobs. And in order to actually fiddle with what is the optimal position of these different knobs, you typically use a technique called backpropagation, where you automatically find out these weights by training with a set of examples. Now this looks like a quite simplistic idea, but has had significant impact. Actually, if you look at the Nobel Prize for Physics, which was awarded to John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton, they really got this Nobel Prize for what I would sort of think is a computational algorithm. Of course, it has some physical principles underlying it, but that's very, very interesting. It's also very interesting that somebody else has recently pointed out that what they invented, or what they get the Nobel Prize for, which is something called a Hopfield network and the restricted Boltzmann machine, are actually not used today anymore. Nobody trains neural networks using Hopfield networks or restricted Boltzmann machines. But still, the insights which they gained from this were very substantial. And of course, you also have seen that the Nobel Prize for chemistry was awarded to 3 scientists, and 2 of them focusing on AI developments for protein structure prediction. So I think this shows you that even though these concepts, which I've just shown you very superficially, are very, very powerful and have a lot of potential applications. So now this comes to the actual topic of this talk. Because of course I was asked to talk about something which we also do in our research, and how you can apply AI to medicine. And if you look at the literature, this is now the popular literature, not so much the scientific literature, there are a lot of headlines about the potential of AI in medicine. Actually, this cover page from the Spiegel is actually from this week's edition of the Spiegel, so there's still a lot of excitement about this topic. But I also wanted to highlight this article, which also indicates that while there's a lot of potential, there's also a lot of hype. And this happens quite frequently. If you remember back to the COVID pandemic, I know many of you might not want to think back to that, but you probably realized there were a lot of people who promised, oh, we have an AI algorithm which can listen to your voice and will listen to your speech and tell you whether you have corona or not. Or they listen to how you cough and they can detect corona from this. Of course, none of this really worked. And this is something which we also have to keep in mind when we apply this in medicine. Is I think we have to be careful that we don't fall into that trap, that we generate so much hype and then are unable to deliver all the promises which we make. But let me actually show you some of the applications which AI could tackle in medicine. So what is the vision for an AI system in medicine? Well, first of all, in medicine we have a lot of data. We have data which comes from imaging devices, from wearable sensors like your smartwatch or from your ECG monitor. You have clinical records. I hope your clinical records don't look like this, because if they look like this, you can't really use them for AI. But if you have them in digitized form, that's very powerful. There are a lot of omics information which we have about each individual patient, not only genetics. We have proteomics, all sorts of other possible data sources. And we have, of course, also a lot of information about your lifestyle, for example, about your nutrition, what you eat, what you drink, and so on. And of course, that list, I can sort of probably keep on extending this list for many more hours. The idea is we integrate all that information into a computational model, into an AI model, and we all use it as a whole in terms of making, for example, a decision about diagnosis. Can we, for example, integrate all that information into a diagnosis? And this is perhaps something which actually in medicine is not that common, because in medicine is a discipline where you typically have, for each of these things, a specialist. You have, for example, a radiologist. You have an electrophysiologist. And they typically look at components of the data and not at the whole picture. So with AI, we have the potential of really integrating all these different disciplines and making a decision which takes all that data into account. But of course, we not only want to make a diagnosis about a patient, we want to go one step further. We want to actually predict what is the outcome of a treatment. So once we have made a diagnosis, for example, identified that the patient has cancer, we want to actually understand the cancer type, the tumor type, and actually find the best possible treatment for that individual patient. So that's something very important. We not only want to make a diagnosis, we also want to find a way of helping to cure the patient. And one key approach for helping us with that is something which we call stratification, where we don't treat, for example, the whole population, or we don't assume that clinical guidelines apply to a whole population, but that there might be subpopulations, which, for example, respond different to treatment, and, for example, which have certain disease prevalences. So, for example, we know that Asian populations have a higher prevalence of diabetes than, for example, the Western population. So if we use that prior knowledge, we can integrate that and identify these patient subgroups. But ultimately, we don't really want to only identify patient subgroups, but we want to actually completely personalize medicine in such a way that we actually find what is the optimal diagnostic threshold, optimal treatment threshold for individual patients. And that is really the aim of personalized medicine. And I think here again, AI is absolutely critical in actually delivering that, because that's not really possible without AI. And of course, there are a whole bunch of other things which we can do with AI. For example, we can identify new drugs. We can do drug repurposing, i.e. take an existing drug, which was developed for a certain purpose, and actually identify that this might be very useful in a completely different scenario to what we had in mind. And the way you can, for example, use AI here is, for example, if you take an AI model, which is this neural network here at the top, and if I plug in my entire database of medications which I have, and then query it with a certain disease pattern, I can, for example, predict the likelihood that this drug actually produces an indication or a contraindication, but I can also try to actually get back out of the neural network an explanation for why that's the case, and that might help me really with finding a path to a drug which is targeted at that particular disease. Now, there are many other tasks, and I don't really want to list them all, but perhaps just highlight a few. Of course, the easy gains are perhaps in something completely mundane, where you automate workflows in a hospital, where you streamline processes, for example, generate documentation with AI, generate medical reports with AI. None of this really delivers a better diagnosis, but it actually will save a lot of time for clinicians, which they can then use for other purposes. Of course, also in a healthcare system, you can optimize efficiencies by, for example, predicting how long will a patient stay in the ICU or in a hospital, how many beds will you have available tomorrow, and which patients you, for example, need to see first. And a lot of that can also help you with improving healthcare in low-resource settings, like in countries where you just don't have a very powerful healthcare system. But it can also help you with reducing energy consumption in the healthcare system, or, for example, minimizing waste. But what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is focus a bit in one particular area of medicine and show you a few concrete examples. And those are I've chosen the area of radiology because I think, first of all, it's the area in which I work, so I'm slightly biased towards this. But also, if you look at, for example, what is actually out there on the market as an approved product for medical applications, the FDA is the Federal Drug Administration in the US, which typically has a sort of lead role in approving AI solutions. Almost 3/4 of the solutions are in radiology. So radiology has always been a very digital sort of domain, and that's perhaps where this is, why this is the case. So let's look at a few applications of what I can do in radiology. And I wanted to sort of also highlight that in radiology I can do a lot of things with AI, not only improving the diagnosis of the patient, but for example, acquiring images in a better fashion, quicker, improving image quality, so making it easier for the radiologist to diagnose from these images, quantify biomarker from the images, and so on. And I will show you a few of those applications, and hopefully you sort of get an impression for what we can do with this technology. So for those of you who have never seen an MR image of a heart, this is how my heart looks in an MRI scanner. You see you not only get an image which shows the heart static, but you actually get an entire sequence of frames, almost like a video sequence. And that allows you not only to look at the structure of the heart, but also look at how the heart's moving and how it's contracting and whether it's actually doing its job properly, as sort of pumping blood through the body. Now, if you understand a bit how these images are generated, then it's perhaps useful to look at a picture like this. So this is an MRI machine. We actually saw one of the high-field MRI machines here at the hospital earlier on, which looks even fancier than this one. And that device, which is quite big, quite heavy, produces or collects data from the patient. And once we have collected data from the patient, we can actually transform it into an image. But actually it's not like a video camera that it's optically acquired data. It uses magnetic fields to look at how much water is in different parts of the body. So what it actually measures is not pixels, but it measures something called the K-space. And the K-space is just a representation of the image in the Fourier domain. So what we actually measure is frequencies, and we have to measure these frequencies sequentially. So we have to go through this K-space, measure each frequency one after the other, and then we can apply a Fourier transform, or if it's an MRI, if it's a CT scanner, it would be, for example, a radon transform. You can reconstruct the image. But the reason why this is so slow, when you I don't know how many of you have ever been in an MRI scanner. Okay, so quite a lot of you. So you realize that this is not a snapshot, and it's not like you're lying in there for 2 seconds and you get out again. You're lying there for quite a bit of time. And one of the questions is, can we reduce the time you have to spend in the scanner? And there is, of course, an engineer solution or a computer science solution to this problem, which basically says is, let me just collect less data. I'm going to throw randomly data away, and if I only collect 1/4 of the data, and you see here I'm randomly sampling from this, if I only collect 1/4 of the data, then actually the scan is 4 times faster, because I only have collected 25% of the data. But you can also probably see that the image looks much worse. So this is a classic task for AI. And the AI task is, can we take this corrupted image, which has a lot of artifacts which come from all sorts of problems, you violate Nyquist sampling theory and all sorts of other things, can we go back to the original image and make it easy for the radiologist to diagnose this patient, but actually also accelerate the acquisition? And the way we can do this, and I don't want to go too much into the technical details, is by using neural networks, which we call convolutional neural networks, which are trained with corrupted images And we can actually generate this training data very easily because we can just undersample artificially our images and with high quality images, and we train the network to reconstruct these images as good as possible. And this actually works surprisingly well. So what you see here is, for example, a set of cardiac images acquired with more than 10-fold acceleration. So it's 10 times shorter. And you can see nothing in this image, correct? It looks really horrible as an image. But if you use this deep learning algorithm to reconstruct this, you actually get very high quality images which look almost identical to the fully sampled images. So this works really well because images are very compressible, have very much redundant information, and we can do this actually really quite nicely. So this is a quite nice application. And of course, if I train this with brain images instead of images of the heart, I can reconstruct brain images, which is not surprising. But when I showed this for the first time, then the first question was always, well, what happens if I train with data which looks, for example, doesn't have a tumor in it, and I want to reconstruct a tumor? Can I still do that? And so we spend a bit of time investigating this. So if you train your model with brain images, it actually works really well. But if you train it with knee images, which is something you see here on the right-hand side, so this neural network is trained with MR images of the knee, and it does a pretty good job at the top where I don't accelerate too much. But at the bottom, I don't know if some of you can see this, it almost looks like a hallucination of a knee appearing inside the brain. That shouldn't really happen unless you had a very horrific accident. So this is an hallucination which shouldn't really happen. So you have to be careful with these type of approaches, and this is something in general you hear quite a lot about. AI can hallucinate, and here the AI is hallucinating because it hasn't got enough data. In the top case, you see it still works because I'm only throwing away 75% of the data, but at the bottom I'm too aggressive and it will not work. But I wanted to also highlight is that this has really a significant impact in the field, because it not only allows you to acquire images faster, but to do very cool things like this. So this is a paper which came out in Science earlier this year, where people developed, this is from a group in Hong Kong, where they developed an MRI system at ultra low field. So the MR scanner you have here at the hospital typically has 3 Tesla. You also have a 7 Tesla. So that's, I think, what was it, like 150 times the Earth's magnetic field. 0.05 Tesla is extremely low field. It's very, very low field. Now this scanner costs around $20,000-$30,000. The high field MR scanner, which Siemens sells you here, probably costs around $3 to $4 million. So for example, in the developing world, this is a really cool system. Not only because it's cheap, also it doesn't really require supercooling, it doesn't require liquid helium cooling, it has a lot of other cool things. And if you look at the images you reconstruct, they look great. And why do they look great? Because all of these systems use AI to work out what are all the artifacts, because you have imperfect hardware. The hardware is really cheap. But the AI can learn what are the artifacts which are produced by this cheap hardware and still produce images which look really good. And I think this is very, very exciting. And this AI solution, which I showed you earlier, has been developed by many groups, including ours, but also is now commercially available. Almost every scanner in the world you now buy has some form of this AI in it. And it's not only useful for MRI, but you do the same thing with, for example, handheld ultrasound probes, which you plug into your smartphone. And they typically produce really, really bad images because you have a very cheap probe, you have a lot of compromise you have to make with the transducers and so on. with AI you can compensate for this and actually produce good images. And perhaps sort of this is the final example I want to show you here. This is something which is ultra low dose CT, where you reduce the radiation dose for the patient really very significantly and still produce clinically useful images by integrating all this AI knowledge into the reconstruction. So this is really something which I think is very cool and sort of opens up new ways of doing imaging, which of course is absolutely central in medicine. So I want to briefly switch and show you one or two other applications before I also show you some of the open questions. Of course, we can use AI to interpret images, and I think many of you will have come across this. We can use these neural networks to, for example, extract structures in the heart, like for example here, figure out what is the ventricle contracting in the heart, where are the atria contracting here. And if we sort of integrate all this information, we can sort of build very comprehensive 3D models of the entire heart and how the heart's beating. And at the same time, there are a lot of initiatives like this one, for example, called the UK Biobank, where they're collecting data from hundreds and thousands of patients. So UK Biobank has collected information from over 500,000 subjects, and for 100,000 of them, they even do all this comprehensive imaging. They do a whole body MR scan, so you see your entire body in 3D. So I'm just showing you here a 2D slice, but this is a 3D volume with a dedicated brain imaging sequence, with cardiac imaging, with lifestyle information, genetics, and clinical records. This works very well in the UK because the UK has a very sort of centralized healthcare system, where you can link all of this together, but it's a tremendous resource, especially because it's publicly available. So any researcher in the world can get access to this data and use this data for research purposes. And of course, if I have 500,000 of these subjects, I cannot really analyze this data with humans. I have to use AI. And I can, for example, generate reference charts which tell me, for example, how does, for example, your cardiac mass change with age? What's the difference between males and females in cardiac output? And how does this output change over time? So we can now sort of generate, based on a huge population, all these values. And for example, if you're now a patient and you're a 35-year-old smoker with hypertension, we can now generate reference values which are really customized to that patient and tell you something about your risk of cardiovascular disease. But we can also sort of correlate, for example, all these things with lifestyle. So here, what I'm showing you is sort of all these cardiovascular parameters correlated with, for example, physical activity, with smoking, with alcohol consumption. And you can sort of now look at which ones of these lifestyle parameters have a very high correlation with or impact, for example, your cardiac output or other parameters. And that's a very useful resource for generating new hypotheses about biomedical research. And perhaps the last application which I want to show you before I go to the challenges is we can also predict survival of patients if they have a certain disease. And I'm going to stay with the heart because I showed you a lot of images of the heart. Let's assume you are very unfortunate, you have pulmonary hypertension. The outcome in this might not be very good, so we can take, for example, information about your structure of the heart, but also we can look at the anatomy of the heart and the function of the heart. So the spaghettis which you see here in this plot are not really spaghettis, but they're actually the motion trajectories of different points on the surface of the heart throughout the cardiac cycle. So you can now look at how is the heart contracting and do I see any abnormalities in this contraction. And if I take all of that data, compress it in a neural network, but in such a way that this compressed representation is useful for predicting outcome, I can actually do a much better separation of patients which have, for example, a poor outcome versus patients which have a good long-term survival. So this is something which I think is very interesting and really powerful. So I also very briefly want to cover some of the challenges and not only show you all the nice pictures, but also highlight what are the problems. And one problem which I think is quite predominant is something which a lot of people talk about and say, well, this is, how do I trust my AI? How do I know that it's actually reliable, trustworthy? And if you sort of look at this definition, which is, by the way, from the definition by the European Union on trustworthy AI, has all these different components. And some of them are non-technical, so I don't really want to talk very much about them. But I wanted to focus on those 4 areas just very briefly, because they sort of relate to technical aspects which we can control as engineers. And the first one I want to show you is illustrated by this picture. If you contrast this picture, and if you think you build a machine learning model of this group of patients versus this group of patients, you can probably see that this group of patients is not very representative of the general population. And there are many papers which have illustrated the fact that if you have such biases in your models, they can not only affect individuals, they can even affect entire populations, and we really have to take that into account. So that's one important aspect. Now, a second important aspect is, this is something which those of you who have some experience in machine learning probably can sort of illustrate this on this example here. I think today is Halloween, correct? So you have a lot of pumpkins. If you build your model with all these pumpkins, you might have millions of these pumpkins. And then you apply it to this set of pumpkins, and will probably not work either, correct? And this is, for example, what quite often happens if you take a healthy group of people, you build a model from them, and then you apply it in your hospital. Nothing works because, of course, all these patients who are in the hospital are sick, they have pathologies, and your AI model no longer works, correct? So this is a significant problem. And, of course, you can buy these scanners in lots of different configurations, not only different colors, but different actual physical hardware, and every time you do that, you get an image which looks slightly different. And that means it's very hard to use. And a final point I want to make is sort of that, of course, there's a lot of privacy concerns also about this. So this is an article in the Financial Times from a couple of weeks ago in the UK, where the author suggested is, well, we should use all of the NHS health data to make improvements through AI possible. But of course, if you, for example, would write such an opinion in a German newspaper, people would go very crazy, because they say, well, how do we ensure privacy? Privacy is very important. Actually, a colleague of mine from Munich, some of you might have heard about her, Alena Büchs, she used to be the head of the German Ethics Council. She has made several statements where she says, well, of course privacy is important, but you also realize that not sharing data is killing people, because we can't really make use of data. So it's a very hot topic, and rather than have an ethical discussion about this, I want to give you a bit of a technical discussion on this. And say, well, perhaps there are some AI tools which can help you with privacy. That's not the first thing you think about, but let me try to convince you that you can actually do that. The first AI component is something which is called federated learning. And here in this idea is you take your AI model, and instead of bringing all the data to the AI model, you take the AI model, you send it to hospital A, You update it, you learn it, you train it with data from hospital A, you send it back, and then you keep on repeating this. And there's an obvious advantage here. The data never leaves the hospital, correct? The AI model gets sent to the hospital, but the data never leaves the hospital. Only the AI model travels around. Now, this looks like a cool solution. It's not a perfect solution, so it also has some problems associated with it. And if you wanted to learn a bit more about this, this highlights this. But I wanted to also show you why it's not a perfect solution. Well, it's not a perfect solution because of a problem which you see on this particular slide. Here's an AI model which I've trained with this data. So there are some images, a breast MR image or 2 breast MR images, a CT image of the head and a liver CT. And I give you this AI model. If you're very, very clever, you can take that AI model and invert back what was the data which was trained to build this AI model. This is something you would call a model inversion attack, where you reconstruct your image or your training data from your compressed model. And that is possible and something which is a bit dangerous if you then send these AI models around. Again, there are ways of dealing with this, and I wanted to show you this in an example. It's something called differential privacy, and involves a bit of randomization and a small example. And I've taken an example from the US election because it's just around the corner. So let me assume that I want to ask you who you would vote for in the US election next week. Now, some of you might be very happy to tell me who they're voting for. I can assume who they vote for. But some of you might be very hesitant to tell me that they're voting for the other guy. But let me assume I still want to figure out what's the opinion in the room. So we'll come up with a very small game. And the game is as follows. Each of you throws a coin in the air, and you don't tell me what the outcome of this coin flip is. But we have the following arrangement. If it comes up head first, you write on a piece of paper the true answer, what you would actually vote for at the next week. If it doesn't come up head first, you take a second coin, you also flip that second coin. Again, you don't tell me what the result of the coin flip is. And then, if the coin flip is heads up, you say Kamala. If it sort of tails up, you say it's Donald. So what happens in this scenario? Well, there are 2 components in this. One is the top bit. That's a true answer, correct? That's my true signal which I can measure. The bottom bit is pure noise. Because why is it pure noise? Because it's determined by a coin flip, correct? I cannot. It's only random. Now, what I observe, if I count your votes, is still a pretty good approximation of the true signal, because if this noise is small and the true signal dominates, if I calculate, for example, the average number of people who voted for Kamala and for Donald, I would get a pretty good approximation of the true answer. However, if I, for example, take one of the persons there sitting in the first row and she tells me she voted for, I tell her, you voted for Donald Trump, what have you done? Then you can always say, well, actually, I have not voted for Donald Trump. It was a coin which forced me to tell you that as an answer. So you have something which you call plausible deniability. I cannot really be sure of what you have actually voted for, correct? Because there was a bit of randomness involved. Now, why do I tell you this? Well, if you add this to your machine learning algorithm, and if we go back to this scenario which I've shown you before, if I now try to reconstruct what I have trained with, I can no longer get actually back the data which I've trained with. So adding this differential privacy is a bit like cryptography. You can mathematically give you guarantees that you're no longer able to reconstruct your data. And I think that's very useful. So the last 3 minutes, if I have 3 minutes time, I wanted to just highlight a few things which I think are also very exciting. And these are sort of 3 different trends which are currently happening. And when I say currently, they're sort of taking place over the last 12 months. So everything is moving so fast that everything which is older than 12 months is ancient history in AI terms. One of this is something very technical called attention-based networks or transformers, and they are sort of effectively the backbone of things such as ChatGPT. The second thing is, people in medicine have always worried about sort of where do I get enough training data from where I have annotations? Because if I don't have human annotations, what can I learn from? So people have developed this self-supervised learning techniques, again, which has been very sort of influential in natural language processing, where you, for example, take text and you mask a bit of the text and you try to reconstruct the text. And it turns out that this, if you do it on a massive scale, is incredibly powerful. It seems very simple, but it's very, very powerful. And finally, you have this idea of sort of taking the top 2 bits and combining them into what people either call foundation models or large language models. And then you have a model which you can query with text, and that model can solve a lot of different applications. It's no longer limited to only reconstruct images or diagnose a disease. It can do a lot of things. You potentially can also use it in communication between patients and clinicians, in education and so on. And I wanted to show you an example of such a model, which is something we have developed in our group. For example, looking at ophthalmology images of the eye, using an imaging technique called OCT, optical coherence tomography, where the aim is to actually develop a model with which you can, as a clinician, interact completely with text and images. So, for example, the clinician might say, well, write me a report about this image, and then the output of the model would be similar to a radiology report, an ophthalmologist report of that image. And that system can now solve different tasks. So you can, for example, ask the system, are there any abnormalities in the images? And if so, what are these abnormalities? And the system will give you an answer like this. It will say, well, there are no visible AMD, which stands for age-related macular degeneration, biomarkers or abnormalities. This indicates a healthy retina. You can also say as well, show me, describe biomarkers or abnormalities. You get an answer like this in the middle. But you can also say, here are my guidelines for referral to a specialist. Write me a referral letter for this image. And then you get an answer like this. So this is incredibly powerful because you can now sort of interact with the system in a very versatile fashion. But you can also ask the system to explain you the answers. For example, you can sort of look at certain sentences in the answer and say, well, how do they relate to the image? And the system will show you an answer like this and say, for example, the intermediate AMD is visible in this region, the drusen is visible in this region, and so on. So this actually becomes a very interactive but also explainable AI tool. This is not without problems. This is actually also a paper from our group earlier in the year where we also showed that these language models still have problems. They can be sensitive to how much information you give it, the order of information. They're sometimes very sensitive to numbers because they can't deal very well with numbers because they simply look at numbers as sequences of characters and so on. So the problem is not really solved yet, but I hope I have convinced you that if you use some of these AI tools, all your clinicians or your radiologists will look very happy and smiling at the end of the day. You can also see that there's, of course, a lot of bias in this AI model. This is actually a tool called Stable Diffusion. You can see it all generated, if I said radiologist in the pub, It gives me all male subjects, all with white coats. Of course, I could also postulate perhaps the bias comes not from the fact that I've said radiologists, but because these people are all sitting in a pub and men are more likely to sit in a pub than women. So perhaps the bias also comes from this region. But hopefully you found this interesting. I also wanted to just acknowledge all the people in our group who have worked on the different topics which I showed you here today, and also all of these people which have given us money for the research I've shown you today. And perhaps I can sort of finish with this diagram, which is sort of the flow chart for almost for every patient, which you, whether you use AI or not AI, you start at the top left corner and you typically end up at the bottom right corner. But perhaps if you use AI cleverly in the future, you can space out the time in between, and hopefully that will work. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. So, are there any questions from the audience? Please.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have just one question. In the beginning of the slides, you showed this personalization of patient, right? And the example with this radiological machine creating blurred images and then populating or recreating with the perfect image. Isn't it generalization? Like, isn't it opposite to personalization of patients?
So of course, so if I understand correctly, your question is sort of personalization directly opposite to generalization? Yeah. And I would sort of make 2 points. So from an AI model point of view, I think we want definitely generalization. We want a model which can explain all the data it sees. So data from patients with pathologies, but also from healthy patients. So in that sense, the AI model should be able to explain everything it has seen. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people come to the conclusion that, for example, in many cases in medicine, there is no such thing as, for example, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. There are lots of different forms of this, and in order to treat an individual patient, you need to really identify the subtype of disease and make it very personal specific. But I don't think the two sort of compete in a sense. So that with the AI model, I really want to understand, for example, disease subtype for an individual patient. But that I can only do if I have an AI model which can explain everything, correct? So I do think generalization and personalization in medicine are not really competing with each other, but both are very difficult to achieve. So having an AI model which is really generalizable is super hard to build, and personalization of medical treatment is the holy grail in medicine, correct? Not only if you use AI.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Very impressive talk, and I have a question about the MRIs and the CTs. CTs tend to have a less good resolution than MRIs. Could it be possible to enhance the resolution of CTs by using MRI images for training data?
So this is something which people have tried to use, not directly for CT to MRI to CT, but there are lots of different MRI sequences, some which take very long time and have poor resolution. So what you often do is you take one high-resolution MRI scan, and then they use it as prior information for enhancing, for example, another MRI scan. With CT and MRI, it's a bit difficult because the contrast is so different, and sometimes you really, for example, in brain CT images, you see very poor contrast between white and gray matter. So it's hard to do across modalities, but within modalities, it's sometimes done. You can also do a CT scan, for example, very fast, a very low dose CT scan, and then focus in on a certain region and do that high resolution afterwards. So that's a possible way of doing it.
Any more? Florian?
Thank you for your lecture. I have no technology background, so sorry if my question is in the wrong direction. Concerning the MRI, today's MRI shows the things how they are. Well, they are 100% correct, if I understood the case base correctly. And the new thing with the AI, it shows how it probably is. Like you give less pictures in it, and it calculates how it should be. So what makes you so sure that it's always correct for any human, for any person, however different it is, and you've never seen it?
So I think that's a very good question. And strictly speaking, if I want to reconstruct an image with a certain resolution, we know from Nyquist's sampling theorem, I have to have a certain number of measurements, otherwise I can not do it, correct? The reason why I can still do it with AI, and why I think it is also very safe to do it with AI, is that almost everything which I have in the real world is compressible. So for example, if I take an image and if you store it on your computer, you typically store it in JPEG format or some other format, and that typically does a compression of the image to make it smaller. And if the compression rate you apply is limited, then I think you have almost no possible way of sort of losing data. However, if you overdo it, if you compress it very aggressively, then you might be in this scenario where I can no longer guarantee that I've not made something disappear which should be there, for example, a tumor or something else. But let me sort of try to also answer it with another example why this typically works. Is these sampling theorems, which we know from mathematics and signal processing, they assume the absolute worst case. They assume that if an image is, for example, complete noise, if it's just completely every pixel is complete noise, completely uncorrelated, then that image is no longer compressible. You can take a compression algorithm and you will not be able to compress it because it has such high entropy. But that never happens in reality. In reality, I always have data which is not complete noise, because otherwise there wouldn't be any structure in it. And that makes these images compressible. And what I just need to do is I need to make sure that I don't compress too much, I don't accelerate, for example, too much, so that I still have some empirical guarantees. But I will no longer have theoretical guarantees. But then you typically do what you always do in medicine. You do, for example, a clinical trial where you use this technology many times, and you compare it many times to the completely sampled data, and you work out whether you observe any differences. That's the only way of doing it. But it's, I would say in practice, this is also how we do clinical trials for drugs and other things, correct? We have no guarantee. We don't understand the drug completely. We just have done it in 100 patients or in 1,000 patients or 10,000 patients, and it has worked, correct? That's the same principle. That's the empirical nature of medicine, I guess.
Of course, it's an important new field in mathematics, right? To really do the error control and things like that. I mean, as a mathematician and looking at this very corner in the bottom, in the end, you will have the true solution. So is machine learning data also taken from the true object in the end?
What do you mean?
I'm looking at this very last box here, you know. You could just use donated organs, right? And then check, was it correct? Is that an idea that is...
Well, actually, that's sort of, for many things, the gold standard, correct? You need pathology confirmation. but that is something which I can very rarely get, correct? I mean, the number of, for example, we have a project where we look at patients with a certain type of cancer. If you're lucky, you'll get 100 patients with pathology confirmation. So that is the ultimate gold standard, but it's, I think we have to learn from other types of data because we'll never have enough pathology data to do that, unfortunately, or fortunately perhaps.
Thank you, Professor Rückert, for the nice talk. I have one question regarding your system, your visual language model, and I was regarding how does the evaluation is being performed. So from what I understood, there is an explanation of the text and you show the segmentation. So are the masks part of the training part, and how do you evaluate those, like with clinicians, or how could you do this done automatically? And the second question is whether the training is based on the, let's say, patient records and OCT images.
So the training is actually in this particular case done by automatically, so we have some measurements for these images and then we generate automatically questions and answers. So you have question and answer pairs which you train your language model with, but they're automatically generated on something like 20,000 patients, and then we have a small set of 200 subjects for which an expert has actually curated the data. So it's a mix out of computer-generated data and expert-generated data, because otherwise we would not be able to get our clinical colleagues to do 20,000 patients. Now for this bit here, the question, if I understand correctly, is sort of, is this a segmentation? Yes, it is actually. So this is, for example, what goes into the training of the algorithm. So you have a segmentation of a structure. We generate some text about that structure. For example, this layer of the retina has a thickness of that many millimeters and a volume like this. And then we sort of train the algorithm, and when you then sort of go for the explanation, you look at which activation in the image has created this part of the text, and then you sort of link them together like this. So this is basically sort of similar to GradCam, or I don't know if you're familiar with some of these techniques. You basically look at which parts have activated the neurons and neural network to generate this bit of text. I do have to say, we generate this because our colleagues wanted to see how well this works. I'm not a huge fan of these explanations in medicine in general, because I think we should not always try to sort of force the explanation to be something the human can understand, because that way we're sort of perhaps in a loop where something might be true but might not be easily understandable with our current interpretation. So in some sense it's more like a sanity check rather than a real explanation, I think.
My question goes towards rare diseases or new diseases, because I think one risk of using these large amounts of data is that you might even more take the risk of underdiagnosing rare diseases or not finding if something new is coming up.
So you're saying you have a higher risk of missing rare diseases?
Yes, because you don't have enough data to train the algorithm on it.
That's true. So I do think, so that's a good point. So I think there are two things I want to say to that. So first of all, you have rare diseases by their nature, you have very few examples. But on the other hand, you can also build these very powerful models of how the normal population or the normal variability looks like in a very large population. And what you can then do is you can try to say, are there some subjects which I cannot really explain with my normal population, And they might be outliers in that sense, but there might also be examples of rare diseases, correct? For example, if you look at genetic variations or other things. So I do think while it's difficult to sort of train a model in a supervised fashion with rare diseases, if you do abnormality detection or outlier detection, it actually probably will help you. And I also do think that in general, I think rare diseases have the problem that if you go in the current healthcare setting to clinicians, they have seen very few examples in their lifetime of this. At least with an AI system, I have potentially can pool all the data across very large populations and help with that. So I do think it's a challenging technical problem, but I do think also AI can help you potentially here.
More questions? I would have a last one myself. So I have a last question, maybe myself. It concerns maybe future generations of doctors. So at the moment, I mean, all these things arrive at a generation who may have still learned to diagnose themselves, to have an intuition, to do surgeries themselves. So I'm thinking, as a mathematician, the arrival of calculators. Of course, if you nowadays go to the market and let a student compute the bill, the probabilities goes wrong is very high. And so I'm imagining the same thing then with the doctors. So what kind of education do you think we have to draw up for the coming generations? I mean, in the medical, they are not exposed to any mathematics and statistics, I mean, serious mathematics and statistics, but they need to know a few things to be able to cope with these methods. So yes. What is your solution at Technical University of Munich? How do you change?
I'm not sure we have a solution, but I do think, for example, the way we sort of think about training doctors will probably change. I've already discussed this with some colleagues in radiology who said, well, perhaps we rather don't need a radiologist in the same form as we do today, but perhaps we need a data scientist in medicine, correct? Somebody who understands complex data sets, whether they're imaging or genetics or other things. But I think the key thing is to sort of think about is if we educate people, we can't just educate them in more and more, we can't put more and more content in the curriculum because there's only a finite amount people can learn in a fixed amount of time. So I think the key challenge is to identify what new skills they need, but also what do we take out of the existing curriculum? And I know we have some experts also in medical education here as well. What skills do they really still need in the future? And which ones they probably don't need? And I think there's quite a lot of things which we might even say these days, perhaps we teach them, but they never need in practice. But it's also a difficult thing because it's medical education is heavily regulated. I don't know how it's in Switzerland, but in Germany it's extremely heavily regulated. So even for a university, it's not so easy to simply say, well, we changed the curriculum. So one of the things we do in Munich, we have sort of an institute of lifelong learning where they do professional education for people who are already trained. They're sort of already experts, they're practicing in their subject, in medicine, and then they can sort of come to this Institute of Lifelong Learning and sort of take new courses and sort of keep gaining new skills, but sort of that's not so much deciding which one they shouldn't learn, but what new skills they learn. And we have, for example, one AI in medicine course for clinicians in that curriculum.
Okay, thank you very much. So I can't see any more questions at this moment. So before I hand over to the president again, let's thank Professor Rückert once more. Just a minute.
So yes, thank you very much again for this fascinating talk and also for answering the questions of the audience. We have a little present for you here. there are some ingredients that may remind you of burn. You may know them already because your relatives are living here. But yeah, thanks again for the great talk.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.
And hopefully maybe in some future you can come again and show us how much progress we have made maybe in a couple of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ja, liebe Gäste, vielen Dank fürs Zuhören und damit möchte ich mich verabschieden. Und wir werden im nächsten Jahr wieder einen Vortrag haben mit einer Forschungspersönlichkeit und ich hoffe, ich sehe Sie dann wieder beim nächsten Vortrag. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Abend und bis bald.